It happened in the space of 5 minutes, a single conversation that shook the most ancient corridors of power. Pope Leo XIV, the first pope to refuse the golden chair, stood face to face with Cardinal Tagle, the man once called the soul of Asia's church. And in a voice both broken and bold, he uttered words so unfiltered, so final, that a marble statue in the Vatican reportedly cracked moments later. But this isn't a scandal. This isn't politics. This is what happens when sacred duty collides with silent compromise. And what the Pope said next left the entire Vatican trembling, not in rage, but in reverence. Before we go deeper, pause. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And if you fear holy confrontation, this might be the moment to quietly click away. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories, not for entertainment, but for awakenings. Still won't? Then answer this: what sacred truth are you still too afraid to face? Pope Leo XIV was not a man of theatrics. He did not need incense to feel the sacred, nor golden vestments to embody authority. He had once slept on the cold floor of a children's hospice in Syria, washed the feet of prisoners in silence, and when elected supreme pontiff, he had stunned the conclave by choosing the name Leo, not after lions, but after the one who dared write truth to emperors. He walked without an entourage. He smiled more than he spoke. And when he wept, he did so openly. Yet beneath that quiet mercy was a spine of iron forged by decades in the shadows of forgotten parishes. And Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle? Tagle was a him in human form. The son of humble Filipinos, he carried the gospel in his laughter, in parables, tears, and stories that disarmed cynics. He preached not with fire, but with fragrance, gentle, fragrant, and unforgettable. In Asia, he was more than a church leader, he was the voice of tenderness. Their friendship had once been described as spirit recognizing spirit. Leo and Luis. The lion and the dove. One carried the thunder. The other, the dew. So when news broke that Pope Leo had summoned Tagle, alone, off camera, with all press and personnel barred from entry, the Vatican shivered. Not because it feared scandal, but because silence at that level always meant something irreversible. The Apostolic Palace hadn't felt that kind of tension since the night Pope John Paul I never woke up. Marble halls stood still. Guards tightened their grips. And inside the crimson-draped chamber, 2 men, brothers in spirit, stood across from each other, carrying a weight no cathedral could contain. And outside? The world whispered, why now? Why him? What line had been crossed, in a church that rarely admits it had any lines at all? Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories, for what the headlines can't say, and what sacred silence never forgets. Still won't? Then speak, is it fear, or pride? That keeps you from truth too heavy for tabloids? The room had no echo. Not because of its design, but because of the weight of what was about to unfold. The Pope spoke first. His voice was low, unhurried, weathered by 1,000 confessions and sleepless nights. Luis, he said, not with authority, but with ache. What weighs heavier, tradition or obedience? It was a question meant for theologians, but here, it was a scalpel. Cardinal Tagle leaned forward, hands folded, his eyes soft but unflinching. Neither, he replied with the ease of one who had lived the answer. Love does. The Pope's eyes did not soften. They narrowed, not in anger, but in sorrow. Then tell me, Leo said, why is love so quiet lately? Why does it speak with caution when the world screams in blood? He stepped closer. Why does mercy now come, with conditions? It was not an accusation. Not yet. It was a wound searching for its source. Tagle responded like a man who had rehearsed grace. With parables. With scripture. With layered metaphors about seed and soil, wolves and shepherds. But the Pope wasn't planting a garden. He was digging a grave. Luis, Leo's voice dropped. Do you know how many letters I've received from priests afraid to quote Christ, because bishops told them not to stir unrest? There was no reply. Only the ticking of the ancient clock behind the tapestry. Since when, Leo continued, did the cross become a press release? Since when, did we choose silence to keep our seats at the table? Tagle did not flinch. But inside, a storm began to rise. He spoke of balance, of diplomacy, of the delicate tensions in dioceses that straddled cultures, creeds, governments. And Leo listened. But his silence now had edges. Balance, he echoed. That word has taken more lives than swords. Tell me, Luis, when did we begin to fear clarity? The dialogue had started as reflection. But it now glimmered with something else, an undertone sharpened by disappointment. A challenge cloaked in brotherhood. Every word was polite. But each one carried a hidden blade, pressed, gently, against something sacred. And still, Tagle answered. Calmly. Thoughtfully. Defensively. But the Pope's eyes were no longer searching. They were warning. The room, still heavy with reverence, had shifted. This was no longer a conversation. It was the overture of a reckoning. Then it came. The shift was not loud. It didn't announce itself with anger. It arrived like a storm cloud folding over a sunlit sky, slow, creeping, final. Pope Leo stepped away from the window, where dusk was painting the rooftops of Rome in gold, and turned back to face the man who once sang psalms beside him in refugee camps. His tone changed. Luis, he said, voice low, the syllables carried more by memory than breath. Do you remember the child in Cambodia you wept over? He paused. The one who held a gun, instead of bread? The name wasn't said. It didn't need to be. Cardinal Tagle blinked. The muscles in his jaw tightened. He nodded, slowly, painfully, like a man being asked to relive his own crucifixion. Pope Leo took another step forward. His voice was now a whisper sharpened into a blade. Then tell me, Luis, why do we fund silence over salvation? There was no accusation in his voice. But there was something worse, the ache of betrayal wrapped in the garment of brotherhood. Tagle inhaled. And with the calm of a man who had memorized his conscience, he began to answer. He spoke of nuance. Of governments hostile to open evangelism. Of the fragile threads that held diplomatic missions together in lands where one wrong word could mean blood. He spoke of protecting missionaries, avoiding expulsion, preserving influence. And then, he invoked their vows. Their shared promise to remain wise as serpents, gentle as doves. Leo listened. Not with his ears, but with the full weight of memory pressed behind his ribs. He turned toward his desk, not to sit, but to pick up a letter. He didn't hand it to Tagle. He simply held it between two fingers, as if it might burn the table. It was short. Typed. And signed by a bishop in a politically volatile region. The letter requested adjustments to official language in church teachings. Urging a more inclusive tone, a reinterpretation of sacred responsibility, and, most painfully, a strategic avoidance of doctrinal confrontation that could alienate secular allies. Pope Leo held it up without a word. And then let it fall to the floor. The silence rang like a bell. Our silence, he said finally, his voice cracking, not with anger, but something deeper, cost that child his voice. Tagle opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The words caught somewhere between his throat and his heart. Pope Leo turned toward the crucifix on the wall. We serve a Christ who spoke when it got him killed. And yet we whisper, to keep our seats at dinners he would have overturned. There was no shouting. No grand gesture. Just a room, now thick with the kind of grief that only truth can birth. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories, for sacred confrontations that expose where our silence has become sin. Still won't? Then speak now. What would you have sacrificed for that child, or would you have folded your collar and looked away? Then the room changed. It didn't creak. It didn't thunder. But something unseen shifted, like the soft groan of heaven leaning in. Pope Leo XIV slowly stood. No robe rustled. No chair scraped. Only the quiet sound of a man carrying a burden no throne could share. He looked at Cardinal Tagle not as a superior, but as a shepherd gazing upon a fellow lamb wounded by the weight of the flock. "Luis," he said, voice trembling with a holiness too deep for anger, "the Church must bleed before it can bless again." He stepped closer, only a breath's distance between them now. "And you," Leo whispered, "must be the wound that heals." The words were not harsh. They did not accuse. They unveiled. For a moment, Tagle said nothing. He simply stood, eyes glassed over, lips parted in disbelief. 1,000 thoughts raced through him. Memories of catechism classrooms in Manila. Of old women pressing rosaries into his palms. Of children he baptized in war zones. Of letters from seminarians who called him Tate, Father. And yet, here, now, he was being removed. He managed a question, barely more than a breath. "You're removing me?" The Pope didn't answer right away. He turned, slowly, toward the towering crucifix that hung over the chamber's west wall. Its shadow stretched toward them, long and solemn, like a finger pointing through time. Then he spoke. "I'm not removing you," Leo said, still gazing at the crucified Christ. "I'm sending you." He turned back to face him, eyes not filled with judgment, but with the sorrow of a man who knew what it cost to obey. Back to the shadows, to the places where microphones don't reach, but God still listens. And in that moment, Tagle broke. But not in pride. Not in defiance. Not even in grief. He dropped to his knees, slowly, deliberately, not as a man deposed, but as a priest returning to dust. His hands folded. His head bowed. And not a single word escaped his lips. Because sometimes, silence is the only offering the soul can make. Leo did not stop him. He only placed a hand on his shoulder. And the two men, giants of the cloth, stood and knelt in a moment that would never be televised, never transcribed, never officially recorded. But in heaven? It was inked in gold. The Vatican press called it a demotion. An internal reshuffling. A political maneuver cloaked in protocol. Headlines swirled with speculation: Cardinal removed after private meeting, power rift within the Holy See? Tagle silenced after controversial stance? But what the world missed was the real story. It wasn't found in the press releases. It didn't echo in televised segments or speculative blogs. Because the truth had not been shouted from balconies, it had been whispered in a holy room, between two men who had nothing left to prove. And when Pope Leo emerged from that room, flanked not by guards, but by silence, he did not run from the cameras. But he didn't perform for them either. He called a closed gathering, just a dozen senior aides and 3 stunned bishops. He did not read from a script. He did not wear ceremonial robes. His voice, though soft, cut deeper than any decree. "We have confused visibility with value," he began. "We've taught our people that to be seen is to be sent, and to be hidden is to be forgotten." He stepped toward the great crucifix in the chamber. The shadows from its thorns touched his face like prophecy. The early church was not birthed in press rooms. It was born in basements. Upper rooms. Catacombs. He turned slowly, his eyes sweeping across the faces of those who still wore robes stitched with gold but carried spirits dulled by politics. "We preach sacrifice," Leo said, "but only model stagecraft. We tell our flock to carry the cross, while we polish ours in marble halls. And then, he named it. Tagle's removal, he declared, is not a stripping away of power. It is a return to roots. He paused. Not for drama, but because the weight of that truth demanded a silence long enough to be absorbed. The room didn't applaud. No one dared. But a single priest, young, hidden in the back, wept. Not from confusion. Not from grief. But because something deep in his soul had just remembered why he had said yes to the collar in the first place. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories, not for ceremonies, but for revelations that don't entertain, they expose. Still won't? Then confess below, when did we start mistaking fame for faith, and comfort for calling? Pope Leo ended the gathering not with applause, but with a whisper. One that did not echo through the room, but carved itself into the conscience of those present. Every generation must choose, he said, his eyes fixed not on faces, but on the crucifix that refused to smile. Will we be caretakers of comfort, or carriers of the cross? The silence afterward was not awkward. It was sacred. No bishop shifted in his seat. No aide reached for a pen. Because in that moment, every man understood, the weight of the gospel is not in the crown, but in the thorns. The meeting ended with no formal blessing. No closing hymn. Just the sound of footsteps, some heavy with conviction, others unsure if they'd ever walk the same way again. As for Tagle, he was not paraded before cameras. He did not issue a statement. There was no farewell mass. No symbolic handoff. He was flown out quietly. At dawn. On a humble chartered flight with 2 suitcases, 1 breviary, and a well-worn Bible. His destination? A remote seminary in India. 12 students. Dusty dorms. A chapel with a cracked roof and a broken bell. He would teach homiletics to novices whose names the world would never know. He would sweep hallways between lectures. And some nights, he would pray with the janitor instead of the faculty. And still, he would be more alive than ever before. Because sometimes, the most powerful ministry is the one no one sees. The one hidden from hashtags, but crowned in heaven. He wasn't demoted. He was deployed. Not to fall from relevance, but to rise into obedience. What would you have said, if you were in that room? Would you have shifted uncomfortably in your seat, wondering if the Pope had gone too far? Would you have asked for clarification, searched for a loophole that let obedience and comfort coexist? Or would you have wept with him, not out of agreement, but out of awe for the unbearable clarity of holy obedience? This story was never about removal. It was never about punishment. Or scandal. Or the tired game of church politics the world loves to misread. This was about release. Release from power. From performance. From applause. From the illusion that visibility is the same as value. Cardinal Tagle was not cast aside. He was called inward. To walk where only heaven hears. To teach where only angels record attendance. To be seen no longer by crowds, but by Christ alone. And if we're honest, that calling terrifies most of us. Because the truth is, most of us don't fear being forgotten, we fear being faithful when no one is watching. So ask yourself, what would you have said, if you stood in that room? Would you have protested, or prayed? Would you have defended your platform? Or surrendered your place? Would you have looked into Leo's eyes and seen a tyrant, or a prophet tired of performing mercy for cameras? This isn't a story. It's a mirror. And it's asking you to decide, not who you admire, but who you would become when the spotlight fades. May we all seek truth with humble hearts. And may your soul not leave Faith Hidden Stories unchanged. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories, not for stories, but for sacred confrontations that make us whole. Still won't? Then say it plainly. What truth here stirred you most, or scared you deepest?